Welcome to Books of Our Time, produced by the Massachusetts School of Law and seen nationwide. Today we shall discuss The Limits of Power, a book about American foreign and military policy, and even more fundamentally, about American government and the American way of life. Its author, who is with us today, is Andrew Bacevich, a former professional military officer who is a professor of international relations and history at Boston University. And I am Lawrence R. Velvel, the Dean of the Massachusetts School of Law. Before I begin the questioning, I would like to make a more elaborate introductory statement about this book, which is the third one by Professor Bacevich to be discussed here. The Limits of Power is, in my opinion, either the single most important or one of the two most important books of the approximately 120 or more discussed over the years on this program. Professor Bacevich believes, and explains why he believes, that our national security policies have been significantly misdirected for about 60 to 70 years. The flaming materialism that has caused this misdirection and the fecklessness of the presidents and the Congresses that have pursued it. He thinks, with ample supporting argument, that George Bush's views were in significant part a continuation of the past, not a break with it, as both Bush and his critics believed. And I think it likely that he feels policies under President Obama could in many respects be the same and ultimately unsustainable. His book should be taken to heart by every person in Washington, yet almost surely won't be. And that way may lie ultimate tragedy. Andy, thank you for coming up from BU. I normally don't make statements like this at the beginning of a program, but I do think your book is so important that I thought I would make it so that to try to encourage people as much as I can. And I think this program, I hope this program will also encourage them to read the book. It's not very long. It's about 230 pages, if I remember.
Yeah, it's short. Mm-hmm.
And it's very salient. So let me start out with this. You say on page 72, and I'm going to, during this program, also unusually, I'm going to read some of the things you've said, and we'll put them on the screen, because they are so candid and so powerful. I've rarely read anything of their same quality in foreign affairs books or any other kind of book. On page 72, you say that an important analysis, an important component of your overall analysis, which also includes national security policy, is you say that, quote, the political crisis confronting Americans today, unquote, is that our governmental system, quote, poses a clear and present danger to those it is meant to serve, unquote. And then you go on to say, or you've said actually just slightly before, in connection with the same point, quote, the Congress is a haven for narcissistic hacks for whom self-promotion and self-preservation take precedence over serious engagement with serious issues, unquote. And you also say, no one, and this is a quote, no one today seriously believes that the actions of the legislative branch are informed by a collective determination to promote the common good. For this very reason, periodic congressional efforts to curb abuses of presidential power are mostly for show and mostly inspired by a desire to gain some partisan advantage, unquote. Now, I think all of that is correct. One doesn't normally read that kind of a thing, and never before have I read anybody who said that a political crisis arises because our government is itself a clear and present danger to our system. So perhaps you could elaborate at some length on why you have said these things.
Let's begin talking about the two parties. I think that might be a good way to kind of get at the subject. I think the first point would be to acknowledge the significance of the fact that politics in our country is monopolized by these two parties, that there is no meaningful third choice, third point of view, anything that really that does not fall within what's the accepted views of the Republican or Democratic Party is basically viewed as heresy. Doesn't count, doesn't get a serious hearing. And although as Americans we accept the fact that we have this two-party system, it seems to me that in some senses it's good for us to step back and recognize the extent to which that fact alone really limits debate, limits our choices. The second thing I think to be said about the two-party system is in many respects, it's a one-party system. Granted, to listen to Republicans talk about Democrats, to listen to Democrats talk about Republicans, if you take their rhetoric at face value, you would reach the conclusion that these two parties are polar opposites, that they believe in fundamentally different things. But most of that's theater. The truth is that the similarities between Republicans and Democrats on very important issues are far more important in determining the substance of our politics than the differences. And in that sense, the two-party system really becomes a one-party system. In that sense, although we go through the motions of having a democracy, going through the motions of competitive elections, going through the motions of allowing the people to choose, in a sense the game is rigged, that the outcome is determined even before the election happens.
I think you point out later on that the Congress actually has, in your judgment, only one party called the Incumbents Party, and that it does many things to ensure that the incumbents have such advantages that it's very difficult to defeat them, either in a primary or in a general election. And that something like 93% of them get reelected election in and election out. Want to elaborate that a little bit?
You know, it's a fact that according to public opinion surveys, the Congress, among all the major institutions in American life, the Congress ranks the lowest in the estimation of the American people. I can't give you the number, but it's something like 25% of Americans believe that the Congress does a good job.
Yeah, worse than lawyers.
Worse than lawyers. Despite that perception that the Congress basically is a broken institution, you're correct. In the election of 2006, 93% of incumbents were returned to office. How can this be? And I think the answer is that first of all, members of Congress place the uppermost priority on ensuring that they will get returned to office, that they will be perpetual office holders, and secondly, that they have mastered a set of techniques that won't absolutely ensure that they'll win re-election, but make it a very high probability. And this has to do basically with the distribution of pork. It has to do with the significance of big money in order to fund campaigns and the advantages that incumbents have in raising big money necessary to win re-election. So again, it is important, I think, for us to acknowledge the extent to which the democracy that we take such pride in an operational sense, really is not so democratic after all.
There is simply no overestimating the crucial importance of money in politics. Just no overestimating it. And they follow the money. I mean, it's the old Watergate thing, and that's what Congress does, follow the money.
I mean, I may have the figure wrong here again, but you and I are speaking here just as President Obama is about to take office, and if I'm not mistaken, his campaign raised $750 million in order to fund his candidacy. And I think we're kidding ourselves if we think that that's all, $2 and $3 donations by poor people who are living somewhere in southern Mississippi. Yeah. The big money comes from big donors, and they give money in large amounts because they expect to get something in return.
Every day in the paper. Today, for example, as we're taping this, one of the papers was carrying information about the amounts of money that Madoff gave to politicians. Same paper was carrying information about the amount of money that large corporations who are currently lobbying for tax relief had been giving corporations. The politicians and the courts, implicitly parroting them, say, well, this is just for access. Well, access is everything in this world. And if you hear what they have to say over and over again, and they're giving you the money, and you don't hear what the other guy has to say, so who do you think, whose policies do you think are going to be put into practice? Here's another thing that you say. Critics of whoever happens to occupy the White House often make a show of decrying the resulting, quote, imperial presidency, unquote. This qualifies as mere posturing. In fact, for members of the political class, serving, gaining access to, reporting on, second-guessing, or gossiping about the emperor president or about those aspiring to succeed him has become an abiding preoccupation. And then at a later point in the book, you say this, but the points are connected. They're in separate parts of the book, but they're intimately connected. You say, explain, regardless of, this is not a quote, but you do point out that regardless of electioneering or who's elected, the establishment is not going to change because the current system provides the Pauls and the people who are elected with immense amounts of money, prestige, and power. And to get it, they pursue all the same policies. And before asking you to elaborate all of this, I mean, I'm just thunderstruck all the time by the fact that the news media seems to focus, now it's on where are the kids going to go to school? Well, they're going to Sidwell Friends, guys. You know, like where else do you think they're going to go? And before that, they focused on what did George Bush have for breakfast today? And in terms of, and the same people get recycled, election after election. Or George Bush II brought in a lot of people who'd been with George Bush I. Obama's bringing in a lot of people who had been with the Clintons. This is all some kind of ingrown establishment. So maybe you would comment on the fact that this decrying is just, this is for to fool the public. Let me put it that way.
The second President Bush, George W. Bush, and his administration routinely abused the power of the presidency and was rightly attacked for doing that. Not just from Democrats and people on the left, but even from some people who define themselves as conservatives. And you know, I would endorse those attacks, and I would condemn the abuses of power by George W. Bush and members of his administration. Having said that, we need to understand the extent to which this concept of an imperial presidency really has come to be enshrined not in our Constitution, but in the reality of the way politics works in this country. I think it's been that way at least since the inauguration of John F. Kennedy, which was surrounded by the same kind of hoopla that surrounds the inauguration of Barack Obama.
Preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States.
Preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States.
So help you God?
So help me God.
Congratulations, Mr. President. All the best wishes, Mr.
You can probably make a strong argument that the imperial presidency goes further back to the era of Franklin Roosevelt. It's not something really, I think, that needs to be argued about. It's the way things are. And the way things are is that both in Washington and generally among the American citizens, there's an expectation that a president will, in effect, serve as something akin to a messiah. That this individual who the press always refers to, frequently refers to as the most powerful man in the world, in fact, can wield power with effectiveness to solve almost any problem, whether it's economic difficulties, whether it's peace in the Middle East, whether it's winning the war in Afghanistan. That this one man supposedly can solve all these problems. And therefore, I think partisan critics of the imperial presidency are indeed speaking hypocritically, because what they want is not to reduce the power of the presidency. What they want is their guy to be the imperial president. Right. And they want their guy to be the imperial president in hopes that when their guy is the imperial president, that he will hire them. He will make them the Secretary of State or the Undersecretary of Defense, so that they can then share in this presumed power and authority and status and stature. I decry the existence of the imperial president, but I think to somehow claim that it is something unique to Bush or unique to the Republican Party is really to radically misread our history.
Yeah, and one could say that, well, there are those who say the imperial presidency started with Lincoln. It underwent a long demise until Woodrow Wilson. But, you're one of the few people other than myself who said a lot of the problem is traced back to the election of 1960. Because that, I think, personally I'm positive, but who knows if I'm right, that's when the politics of image began. And that now people are voting for pictures and for who sounds good, and we put our people through 2 years of the most incredible nonsense to get the nomination, et cetera, et cetera. And image is all. And as you point out, all these guys, they want to be in power. They want the power to do what the other guy's been doing. They want the money, and then afterwards they become lobbyists, they become lawyers, they join think tanks, they join economic consulting groups. Frankly speaking, Andy, I think that Washington has become exactly what the founders of the Constitution feared. It's a centralized government like Versailles was in their day, or the court of King George was in their day.
Well, and I think the other point to add to that is to recognize the role that the Congress has played in the emergence and the persistence of the imperial presidency. According to the Constitution, according to the idea of checks and balances, Congress should be a co-equal branch and should cherish its constitutional responsibilities and should, at least to some degree, serve to check or to counterbalance the authority of the president. I think the reality is that, especially since the end of World War II and the rise of this sort of permanent national security crisis in which we live, the Congress in many respects has thrust authority at the president, right. has abrogated its own responsibilities, especially on anything that relates to national security. Now, members of Congress will, of course, be, especially of the opposite party, will be quick to throw stones at a president who makes bad decisions. But criticism doesn't translate into a willingness on the part of Congress to take responsibility, to share in the responsibility for things related to national security policy in particular. I think the perfect example of this is the congressional elections of 2006. These were elections that were going on at a time when the Iraq War was going very badly, when the Iraq War really was issue number one in the eyes of the American people. The Democratic Party said, elect us, put us in power in the Congress, and we'll put an end to this war. The American people did hand power in both the Senate and the House to the Democratic Party, and the Democratic Party didn't put an end to the Iraq War. On the contrary, with a lot of hand-wringing and fumbling around, basically what the party did was to vote the money that President Bush needed to continue the Iraq War. And I think that is a perfect example of how the imperial presidency survives in large part because the Congress ends up being a tacit collaborator with the imperial president in allowing presidential authority to grow too large.
Which is, the old statement that those who do not know history are condemned to repeat it. And I think it should be partially changed, that those who do not heed history are condemned to repeat it. We saw the same thing for 8 years in Vietnam. And came Iraq, and it happened all over again. One of the things you say, and you've addressed what I'm about to say, but maybe you have some more reasons for it. You say that, quote, the chief attribute of the actually existing system, all of the institutions, structures, and arrangements implied by the word Washington, is dysfunction. The gross incompetence of those who preside over the federal apparatus is appalling and unacceptable. What accounts for such gross incompetence? We get people in there who are often supposed to be the best and the brightest, or at least intelligent, and who can argue with you, yes, the chief attribute is dysfunction.
I mean, a couple of explanations. I think one is size. I mean, it's Washington, meaning the apparatus of government, and this is especially the case with national security institutions. They've become too big, too ingrown, too ineffective. So one of the reasons that we end up with poor performance is because we've got institutions that have come almost to exist to serve their own, to perpetuate themselves rather than to perform the mission. The second explanation, I think, would have to do with basically a phenomenon of groupthink, that there is a conventional wisdom about policy. Again, I'm thinking here in particular of matters related to national security, that this is the way we do things. That definition of the way things are done tends not to be questioned, tends not to be re-examined, and therefore bad ideas get perpetuated, get passed from one generation of policymakers to the next, and frankly are shared by members of both parties.
Now, you say that there are 4 convictions for the underlying, or that constitute the ideology of national security. And 3 of them, you say, tend to, 3 of them seem to me to revolve around the idea that America exists to fulfill what I would call the putative purpose of history, which is to ensure the triumph of freedom. You want to explain how that idea affects us and how it came to pass?
I teach a course at Boston University called Ideas in American Foreign Policy, and what we do in that course is read, it's all primary sources, basically read the texts going back to the colonial era, which have either informed the way Americans have seen themselves and have seen their relations with the rest of the world, or have informed the critique of American foreign policy as it's evolved over time. And as I've taught this course from one year to the next, the first thing we read is John Winthrop's sermon to his followers on the deck of the ship Arabella just prior to landing in Massachusetts Bay to found Boston. And John Winthrop gives this sermon. It's a very powerful sermon. Really deserves to be read. Easily available on the internet, in which he asserts that this community exists in special relationship with God, that there is a covenant joining the members of this community to God, that this community has been assigned by God to perform a special purpose, and that purpose is, in Winthrop's phrase, to serve as a city upon a hill. And as I've taught this course from one year to the next, I have been increasingly struck by how central that idea is as a recurring theme in justifications for U.S. policy. Not everybody uses the same phrase, city upon a hill, although many people do.
Yes.
But But the idea of America as uniquely chosen, of the United States after 1776, having a particular function to perform in relation to history, that the United States manifests the direction in which history is intended to go. This is a set of notions that is pervasive, and I think must be understood in order to appreciate why people like George W. Bush set the course that he set for us in the aftermath of 9/11. And I mean, people watching this show may already have forgotten the kind of rhetoric that accompanied President Bush's claims about what we were going to do with respect to the Islamic world and how we were going to do it. I don't believe he ever used the phrase city upon a hill. But if you go back and, for example, look at President Bush's very important second inaugural address from 2005, it is an explicit statement of this unique American role toward history and toward the rest of the world. You can't understand U.S. foreign policy unless you understand that recurring theme.
We go forward with complete confidence in the eventual triumph of freedom, not because history runs on the wheels of inevitability. It is human choices that move events. Not because we consider ourselves a chosen nation. God moves and chooses as He wills. We have confidence because freedom is the permanent hope of mankind, the hunger in dark places, the longing of the soul.
He was saying at the time, Andy, at the time of the Iraq War, that Iraq will be the start of a series of falling dominoes in which freedom will come and democracy will come to all the countries of the Middle East, and that all people want liberty. And, complete failure to even think about the fact that there are people with completely different traditions and desires than we have.
Now, there are those people who, many people, I think, say that that kind of language is a bunch of malarkey, that Bush himself didn't believe it, that the war is always about oil, or the war was always about Israel, or the war was always about this and that. I myself don't believe that's true. I think that Bush, like many other presidents, perhaps preeminently Woodrow Wilson at the time of World War I, in articulating the ultimate purpose of U.S. foreign policy in these terms, of a responsibility to spread freedom and democracy, I think he genuinely believed that that was our mission. I think that that genuine belief happens to coincide with other purposes that are not so exalted, right, that do pertain to where's the oil and who's going to control it. Right. But to insist that American statesmen are cynics and that the language of idealism is completely cynical and contrived, in a sense, I almost wish that were the case. Right. Right. Because if it were simply cynicism, I think it would be easier to expose it and to shed it. It's the fact that we have this tradition of genuine belief in our mission to spread liberty and freedom around the world that makes that such an enduring aspect of the way we behave.
Andy, the first time you were ever on this program, you made a statement, and I was really sat up straight and said, "Really?" And you said yes, and I had never heard it before. I have since read it many times. What you said was considered accurate by all the historians I read for the last 6 years or so since you were first here, and it relates to this. You said that at the time of the Spanish-American War, America took over the Philippines. McKinley once said, Kinzer points this out, he didn't know what to do with the Philippines after we got them. So he agonized about it in the White House for a long time and fell on his knees, I guess, and prayed to God. And finally, God showed him the light. Well, we have the Philippines. There's nothing we can do but stay there and Christianize these heathen gentlemen, not realizing they were Catholics.
Right.
Yeah. Who's last time I heard, Catholicism is Christian. And you made the point, we didn't talk about McKinley as I remember, but you made the point that we took over the Philippines and Cuba and Puerto Rico because at that time there was this tremendous social and economic gap in this country between the few who were super wealthy and the vast mass of the people, so that we were running out of markets within the country. We were vastly overproductive. And instead of raising the income of the people in this country and creating a market there, we went abroad to find markets. And that has gone on, as I understand it, ever since then, whether you're talking about Smedley Butler invading Nicaragua and Haiti and what have you, I was a racketeer for capitalism, I don't know about Vietnam, but so many other wars that we've been involved with in Iraq. There's always been this duality. We are really spreading the light to the rest of the world when really commercial interests have been driving it to an equal extent. And I think that this has got a 110-year history now in the United States.
Well, you're putting your finger, I think, on a tremendously important point. And that is, does the explanation for our foreign policy lie beyond our borders or within our borders? I mean, President Bush would say that we are fighting in Iraq, we are fighting in Afghanistan because, in his view, that was a necessary response to 9/11. There's a threat out there, and therefore we have to go out there in order to defend ourselves. There is another view reflected in what you just said, but one that I think Americans don't sufficiently appreciate. And that is that the real wellsprings of U.S. foreign policy are domestic. That what we do out there tends to reflect an effort to try to address a problem or some source of dysfunction back here. I mean, again, the example of the Spanish-American War, tremendous economic distress in the 1890s, economic distress that was blamed at the time on overproduction, lack of consumption, and the response is, let's go find markets. Let us go behave out there in ways that we think will alleviate the economic and social crisis here at home. And what this does is, of course, this in a recurring way suggests that we don't really have to fully come to terms with the problems here at home. That those problems can be deferred or managed by undertaking some foreign adventure. Now, in the book, for example, in this book, I suggest that, and I would emphasize this is the book that came out before the great economic collapse of the fall of 2008. It was published in August. I suggest in the book that the real core of the problem that we face is a problem here at home and is a cultural problem. And that the essence of this cultural problem is that even as Americans, virtually to the last person, we celebrate freedom, that the operative definition of freedom has come to be badly distorted and unsustainable. Not everybody adheres to this distorted definition of freedom, but the most commonplace understanding of freedom is that, in essence, it is a permission slip for conspicuous consumption and self-indulgence. with very little attention being given to exactly who's going to pay the bills. And I think in some respects, the global war on terror and the vast ambitions that inform the global war on terror really is intended to sustain this false, I would say, definition of freedom, to defer the necessity for us actually to examine that false definition and to consider whether or not we shouldn't be living our lives in different ways that could make fighting wars in places like Iraq and Afghanistan unnecessary.
You know, Roosevelt spoke of the four freedoms. I've got a different definition of the four freedoms. It's freedom of speech, freedom of press, freedom of religion, and freedom to shop.
Well, that's what it's become.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. And if you remember, as I'm sure you do, when after 9/11 hit, George Bush's advice to the country was go, keep shopping. Go to the mall to show these terrorists that we will not be dissuaded from our chosen way of life. Mm-hmm. Unbelievable. And of course, you extensively make that point in the book that we choose shopping rather than either self-denial or, dare I say it, self-discipline. Mm-hmm. And that we are in the Middle East largely for oil. You know, another thing, the first time you were here, it made certain impressions on me. Another, you and I had discussed before the show that we both were from the Chicago area. We both grew up in the Chicago area. And you said to me, Larry, when we were young, and I was young before you were born, when we were young, did you ever think we'd be sitting here talking about a place like Afghanistan? Well, Afghanistan is the least of it now. We're in Turkestan, Kyrgyzstan, I can't even pronounce the word, Uzbekistan, where they boil people. This is all about oil, isn't it?
Well, one has to be careful not to go too far. In other words, I think there's a charge made that President Bush is an old oil man, Vice President Cheney, old oil man, and these guys invaded Iraq because they wanted to lock up the oil. That goes way too far. I think what is fair to say is that were it not for the fact that so much of the world's oil reserves happens to be located in the Persian Gulf, we wouldn't care a lick about the Persian Gulf. Yeah. We wouldn't care any more about Iraq than we care about Uruguay. Yeah. And so when you go back, if you look for the origins of the Iraq War, and you're willing to look back 4 or 5 decades for the origins of the Iraq War, you get a much longer story, a story that never would have unfolded were it not for the fact that, yes, that's where the oil is. Yeah. And we found ourselves, I think, over a period of many years, step by step, not really understanding where the next step was leading us, going down a path of ever deeper involvement in the Middle East, with that involvement ever more militarized as time went along, that created a situation that by the time you get to 2002, President Bush is able to persuade himself that going to war against Iraq, invading this country, has now become an absolute national security imperative. And yes, we never would have done that were it not for the fact that that's where the oil is.
That's where the oil is, and we live a lifestyle that has demanded ever more oil over the course of the last 30 years. And we have not controlled that lifestyle.
The one guy who insisted that we needed to think about the implications of ever-increasing dependence on foreign oil, every president has decried dependence on oil. The one president who seemed to be willing to confront Americans with their responsibility for trying to undo this trend was Jimmy Carter. Right. Summer 1979, the famous so-called Malaise speech. Right. Again, a tremendously important document that deserves to be reread. And is easy, if people would just Google Jimmy Carter Malaise speech, it comes right up. So Carter is, there's no question he was an unsuccessful president, and I don't mean to suggest otherwise. But he had a moment of tremendous insight in the summer of 1979 when he gave this speech. And the insight was that, this was at a time of the second oil shock, the insight was that the issue was not simply oil, that the issue really was how should we define freedom in this country? And to the extent that, he said, freedom was going to continue to be intimately linked to access to huge amounts of cheap oil, then almost necessarily we were going to go down a path in which the operative definition of freedom was going to be badly distorted. It was going to come to be connected to lifestyle, mobility, personal consumption, and the like. And what Carter said is, we need to see the oil crisis as an opportunity. It's an opportunity for us to rethink our understanding of freedom and to choose a different path, that the effort to achieve energy independence would not simply achieve energy independence, but actually would potentially have a tremendously positive moral and cultural impact on the country at large. Now, the American people just hooted and hollered and said, what are you talking about? We're not interested in any of that. But I myself think that Carter was a prophet, at least for that brief moment. And being a prophet in his own country, he was treated with disrespect, but that doesn't make his prophecy any less true.
In a nation that was proud of hard work, strong families, close-knit communities, and our faith in God, too many of us now tend to worship self-indulgence and consumption. Human identity is no longer defined by what one does, but by what one owns. But we've discovered that owning things and consuming things does not satisfy our longing for meaning. We've learned that piling up material goods cannot fill the emptiness of lives which have no confidence or purpose.
There you go again. Remember that?
Yes. There you
As
go.
what Reagan said to him at the debate. There you go again. And we'll get to Reagan. I'm disposed to say in the it is said that Golda Meir made a very funny joke once to the effect that those damned old Hebrews of 2,000 years ago were so dumb they chose the only piece of land in the Middle East that didn't have oil. What do you think the relationship of Francis Fukuyama's End of History is to what you're saying? You might tell the people what he meant by the end of history.
Fukuyama, very well-known, influential scholar.
They all quoted him.
Teaches at Johns Hopkins University. Now, before he was at Johns Hopkins University, this is back around 1988, I believe, he published a very famous article in a fairly obscure foreign policy journal. The name of the article was The End of History, ? And the essay made this argument that the collapse of the Soviet Empire, which was then visible on the horizon, marked the end to a centuries-long struggle to define what principles should inform political economy. And that the upshot, of course, was that the end of with the 20th century having demonstrated that militarism and fascism and Nazism were unworthy of respect, the end of the Cold War was now showing that Marxism-Leninism or socialism had failed, and the last ideology left standing was liberal democratic capitalism. And the end of history didn't mean that events were going to cease to occur. The end of history meant, in his view, that henceforth humanity would not argue about ideological questions, that everybody now would agree with the proposition that liberal democratic capitalism was the only way to go. Now, the significance of that, I think, for our purposes, is that Fukuyama was the first in a series of thinkers who saw the end of the Cold War as marking a definitive breakpoint in history. That there was before and there was after, and after everything was now going to be different. It's going to be different because, according to Fukuyama, everybody would embrace liberal democratic capitalism. It's going to be different, according to Charles Krauthammer, because this was now a unipolar moment in which there was a sole superpower, the United States of America, was going to preside. It was different, according to William Kristol and Robert Kagan, because this was now the moment when the United States, as the sole superpower, would assert a benign global hegemony that was in the interests of all mankind and therefore would be welcomed by others. In other words, Fukuyama was the first in a group of triumphalist thinkers who said that this breakpoint in history, the end of the Cold War, had created a new order in which American ideas and American power were all but certain to reign supreme. And this fed into expectations about what role we were supposed to play. I mean, I think in this book, I know in earlier books, I used the phrase that both Secretary of State Madeleine Albright and President Bill Clinton had used in claiming that after the Cold War, we had become the indispensable nation, that the world needed us as never before. So the point is, this triumphalist thinking fed a set of expectations that I think were simply false, not empirically sustainable, and also then provided a basis for policymakers to set out to do things that went far beyond what our actual power in the real world would permit us to accomplish.
Poor Fukuyama, he just didn't reckon with Islamic fundamentalism. You know, this idea that we were going to control everything. Remember back in 2002, by the way, we weren't just going to invade Iraq. It was going to be Iraq,
right,
then Iran, then Syria, and North Korea.
Mm-hmm. I mean, the thing I would say on behalf of Fukuyama, if you go back and look at that article, he does make reference to Islamism, to political Islam.
Well,
what he says, though, is that political Islam can never have the kind of broad-based appeal that liberal democracy has. Now, I would sit here in the year 2009 and I would say, well, I really don't think that Islamism is going to become the dominant sort of political culture of the world, but there are lots of people in the Islamic world who are not necessarily persuaded of that. So they don't know, or at least they're not willing to accept, that history has ended in the way that Fukuyama was suggesting.
You know, as a lawyer, we get trained from the first day of law school to have regard for facts. And you made a comment about something was not, their view was not factually sustainable. I mean, do these people not care about facts? That seems to me to be one of the fundamental problems with what's been going on. It's all ideologically based, and as you said, the facts simply don't support that we can put the ideology into successful practice.
I think they tend to focus on the facts that support their preconceived notions. I mean, for example, you know, the arguments about American primacy after the Cold War tended to emphasize American military superiority. There's no question that after the Cold War or today, the United States is the most powerful military force in the world. Problem is that's not necessarily relevant in all respects.
Yeah.
They tended to emphasize the size of the American GDP, which puts us at number one. But they tended not to emphasize or pay attention to our negative trade balance or our low savings rate or the problem of deficits. So I think they cherry-picked their facts to suit their own preconceptions.
One of the other points, the fourth conviction, we've actually been discussing the first three convictions, which revolve around America being the city on the hill, which all others would wish to emulate. The fourth conviction, and this is, I've discussed this on programs before with people, is a conviction that, as you put it, quote, for the American way of life to endure, freedom must prevail everywhere, and that this serves as, quote, an infinitely expansible grant of authority empowering the United States to do whatever it wants, whenever it wants, because by definition it's acting in freedom's behalf. I tend to think of it as a lawyer, you know, here, and therefore you do it here, and therefore you do it there, and therefore you do it in the third place, and if you get stopped anywhere, it's all going to roll back in a domino effect and you're going to be wiped out. So that we end up fighting wars everywhere. Maybe you could elaborate on how this kind of thinking became ensconced in our Washington so-called thinkers.
Well, I mean, it is a puzzle. After World War II, in particular, I think, if you had to pick one moment, probably would be the moment when the Soviets detonated their first nuclear weapon, which, if I'm not mistaken, was August of 1949. That development, breaking the American nuclear monopoly, confronted Americans with at least the possibility of absolute destruction. Now, the possibility was never a probability, but nonetheless, it was the possibility. Policymakers reacted in panic. And even this possibility came to be seen as something that was intolerable. And from that time down to the present, at least there has been a theme in U.S. national security policy that posits absolute security as the minimum adequate security. Now, sometimes
perfection is the only acceptable thing.
Sometimes, in a sense, that manifests itself in defensive ways. And a good example here would be President Reagan's Star Wars project. You know, the possibility of being attacked by ballistic missiles was intolerable, and therefore the United States needed to undertake this tremendously ambitious and tremendously complex effort to try to build an impermeable defensive barrier. But there are times when this idea takes the form of insisting that not simply that we're going to defend ourselves, but that we have to go change the conditions out there that give rise to the potential threat. And I think this has really been what President Bush set out to do with his global war on terror, that having been attacked on 9/11, devastatingly attacked on 9/11, in order to make absolutely, positively sure that would never happen again, it wasn't going to be enough simply to erect more effective defenses. It was going to be necessary to go change the conditions out there in the Islamic world, giving rise to violent Islamic radicalism. So we're going to have to go impart freedom, liberal values, to the Islamic world in order to ensure that the Islamic world would no longer be an incubator to the Islamists who wanted to kill us. Now, I'm sitting here talking to you, and by golly, If everybody in the Islamic world could enjoy liberty and democracy and respect human rights and live in harmony with their fellow human beings, I'm all for it. I just don't think that it is anywhere within the realm of possibility that the United States, even as the most powerful country in the world, has the capacity or the wisdom to make that happen. It's a fool's errand.
Yeah. So, one might say, for example, well, we invaded Iraq so that we could eliminate one problem of the terror, one aspect of the terrorist problem. It's now regarded as false that because Saddam was not involved with the terrorists. But anyway, that was the theory at the time. It was one of the theories at the time. And then we would do Iran, then we would do Syria. Now this is no different from, because every one of these could become an incubator. Like Pakistan may become the next incubator if we go into Afghanistan in a big way. And this is very much like Vietnam, because it was Vietnam today, Cambodia tomorrow, Japan, the Philippines, Hawaii, and then San Francisco. This was the thinking at the time. And whenever any of this stuff happens, you ultimately find out it's not really that way at all. But we have a power elite that sees it this way, and this power elite is a very closed society. They don't. I remember, as I was telling you before lunch, remember the first time I saw you on television. I may even have mentioned this on a prior program. I think it was at the council, making a speech, a luncheon speech at the Council of Foreign Relations, and it was in Washington, I believe, maybe New York. And I remember your body language, your choice of words, everything bespoke somebody who knows he's gone into the lion's den and is going to be jumped, and consequently, quote, appropriately defensive in advance. Because they're not going to listen to you. They're a closed society. Maybe you can comment on how it got to be that we have a closed society and who's a part of that today in a foreign affairs policy making.
Well, in the book I talk about the emergence of the post-World War II national security elite. And I think the first thing to understand is that it's not as if there were not foreign policy elites before 1945. There was an old elite. And I cite as not simply an example, but in many respects the exemplar of the old elite, somebody who now is mostly forgotten, Henry Stimson, Henry L. Stimson. Served as Secretary of War for President Taft. He served as a colonel in World War I in France. He served as the Governor General of the Philippines under President Coolidge, Secretary of State for President Hoover, then came back again to serve as Secretary of War for Franklin Roosevelt during World War II. So this is a guy who'd been around, tremendously seasoned. It's not that Stimson was a saint, but he was a man of great prudence. He was a man who understood power, meaning, therefore, he understood the limitations of power. Somebody who understood war, and therefore was not keen to engage in wars unless they were absolutely necessary. I think he was somebody who understood the need for give and take in diplomacy. And in my judgment, on balance, is a tremendously admirable figure. At the end of World War II, Stimson is an old man. I think he was over 80. And as soon as the war ends in September, within about 2 weeks, he retires and he leaves. And I describe this as a moment of great transition, because here is this embodiment of the old elite now leaving the stage, and as he leaves the city, his counterpart in the Navy Department, the Secretary of War, stays behind. The Secretary of War is James Forrestal, another, I think, tremendously important figure in U.S. history, now, unfortunately, mostly forgotten.
The next time this program is on, it will again be Professor Bacevich, and we're going to take up right where he left off with James Forrestal becoming the Secretary of Defense. So thank you for being with us, and thank you, Andy, and be with us again. And Andy, we will continue what you were saying on the next installment of this program.
Thank you very much.